This takes us back to Christmas in 1968. So the Apollo missions were starting to go. Remember, they had that terrible fire, and so it set them way back, and then they started using the Apollo again. They reshaped it, and it was a much better capsule. And they were worried about the Russians. The Russians still looked like they were on a moon mission as well. And so the Americans said, let's try something really crazy. They'd never gotten outside the Earth, right? They just had been spinning around the Earth. They created this mission that first people said, this is impossible. But they actually sent 3 guys for the first time out to the moon, not to land, but just to see if they could do it, right? Could that rocket and could all that information as far as, figuring out the trajectory, could that all work? So they sent these 3 guys out to just circle the moon a few times and come back. And it was just an amazing kind of thing. Well, they're in orbit around the moon at Christmas time. And so they sent this message back. And if you're wondering, where's this going as far as Genesis, you'll see. Well, maybe. Oh, here we go.
It's now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning was the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament, the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning was the second day. God said, let the waters over the heaven be gathered together into one place. And let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Well, that became controversial, as you can imagine. And so Sharon and I sent a letter into NASA saying, bravo. And they sent us a nice little picture back, which was this picture with that Earth over the moon's surface, that view out the window. It's quite a spectacular picture, isn't it? I mean, it still takes my breath away. It's that total sterility of the moon. There's just nothing, I guess it's got its own stark beauty, but there's just nothing there at all. And then you move up to the sky and see that beautiful blue orb and think that was made for us. Just thank you, God, huh? That's really, really nice. Okay, well, what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is just kind of briefly go over the text, and then I'm going to do a presentation here on the different views of creation. Your text focused more on 2 views in particular, the young Earth, what's called the young Earth view, and the old Earth view. And so I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. These are just quotes from your text, and we'll go through some more things a little bit later. But they said both sides, see, they're treating it as if there's only 2 views, and there are actually many more, but both sides agree that genealogies reveal Adam and Eve were especially created only thousands of years ago. Both sides, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, both sides do a lot of butting of heads, and yet sometimes we need to step back, which I think was good about this article. We need to step back and say, we have a lot in common with our brothers and sisters who may not agree with us as far as when this all happened, but all of us agree that the creation of Adam and Eve is recent, right? Forget the age of the earth for just a moment, right? No matter where your position is, you think, if you're a Christian that buys into one of these two views, you do think that Adam and Eve's creation was recent. Now, the young earthers, that's what YC stands for, young earth creationists, interpret the days as 24-hour consecutive periods of time. Okay, we'll come across that in just a second. The old earthers don't buy into that, and we'll talk about why. And here's the problem, which is unfortunate. It's highly debatable whether this issue merits the rancor and division too often attending it. We're all in the same company, right? We're brothers and sisters in Christ, and yet there's a lot of heat that comes out of this thing. And I thought this author made a good point. It's debatable whether we should be bludgeoning each other over this, huh? Somebody else, well, I guess it was the same author, wasn't it? But it was another essay. How should a Christian understand the age of the earth controversy? Same thing. Both sides believe that the creation occurred just thousands of years ago. The biggest source of this one may step on some toes. I hope it doesn't. I didn't say it. This guy said it. But here's the second point. The biggest source of the controversy is the contention of some, not all, but some of the young earth people who believe that you have to believe in a young earth or you're doctrinally suspect, basically. And so I've heard that and I've read this. And it's really unfortunate. It's not all of them, but some of them make some noise about this and say, you got to be in the young earth camp or we're not so sure about you and the rest of your Christianity. And understandably, the next point, some of the young earth people worry that if you take that view that the older earth is the correct view, that you're making Bible subservient to science. In other words, I trust science more than the Bible. So that's the worry that the young earthers have regarding old earth. Again, where are they together? Young earthers and old earthers agree the fossil record doesn't reveal that molecule to man hypothesis. You know, the single cell developing with that tree of life, and it branches in one way and develops all the plants, and it develops all the insects, and then the mammals come out, and there we are, way up at the top. Right? That's not what the young earthers and the old earthers believe at all. They don't buy into that. So, if that's okay, I'm going to skip past that now. I think this is important. This was from a website, The Daily Beast. As students learn science, they discover that they've been misled by their religious upbringing. So here's where we're going with this. This is actually a pretty critical thing for you that have young people or grandchildren or whatever. Watch what he's going to say here in this article. These people that come out of these sheltered churches and all, they discover that evolution is not tottering and about to collapse. The Big Bang is not an unfounded speculation. The Earth is clearly very old. Noah's flood can't possibly have been worldwide, and the scientific community is not filled with secularist lemmings. The result of these kids, in other words, the result is an intellectual crisis, and many young Christians simply walk away from their faith with a feeling of betrayal. What I'm hoping to do tonight is not to push a particular view on you, but I would like you to encourage you, as well as people you know, encourage them to understand that Christians have different views, and when they go off to college, not to get pigeonholed and not to get beat around the head because the teacher there says, what, you believe it's only 6,000 years? That's crazy. There are other positions that Christians have, and I think we're doing our kids a disservice if we say, this is it and this is it for sure, forget anything else. No matter what your position is, I think we've got to be open, a little bit flexible, and listen and find out what these other positions are. So I'm not here tonight to push a view. I just want to, I hope, clarify what some of these positions are. The Barna Group, you heard of the Barna Group? It's actually a Christian organization that does a lot of research and polling and things like that. So they examined why are young people leaving the church, and the president of the organization, David Kinnaman, wrote a book called You Lost Me, which is sad, huh? People have walked away from the church, so they did a huge survey. Why did you walk away from the church? His answer, at least one of his answers, significant numbers of young adults with a Christian background feel that churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in, and even that Christianity is anti-science. Boy, is that sad, huh? I've got 2 or 3 talks on science that Christianity is not anti-science at all, and you can go to my website, apologeticsforlife.org, and listen to my talks sometime. But isn't that sad? Apparently, this is my guess, I can't prove it, but my guess is they were told one view of creation, went off to college or high school, and got told that's not true at all. And then when it's science versus their church, which way are they going to go? they're going to buy into the science, right? Because the person standing up there in the front has 13 degrees after his or her name. And so you say, all right, I guess that's true. I guess I should dump the church. What did they know? And so they're walking away in large numbers, partially because of the science. They don't feel that Christians are scientific. We don't have any reasons. We just emote, right? We're just emotional. And there are a lot of good scientific supports for what we're talking about. That's what Steve did last week, right? He was talking about the science behind creation. You had a question, Oscar?
No, you know what I was going to say is it's unfortunate that when these kids go to college, their authoritative figure is the professor, and then the professors are the one who's teaching one-sided view, and the grades are in line with whether they side with the professor.
Yeah.
It seems like if you go against his thoughts or his views, your grades drop down altogether.
Yeah.
And it takes me back to that movie, God's Not Dead. Did anybody see that?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The guy, he just stood up and just stuck with his views.
You got to pick your fights pretty carefully, though, don't you? They always say whoever has the microphone wins. Right? So
against the professor, right?
well, I mean, it's you don't want to raise your hand necessarily and say, "Oh, that's just nonsense. I've got a different view." I mean, the professor is going to get very defensive at that point. I mean, you could talk to him afterwards, and there are ways to work it. But you're right; it's a tough call there. Okay, so here we go. We're going to look at different views of creation. I guess the first question, I thought about this about a month ago. I didn't have this slide up here, and I started thinking, well, why do we have so many views? You know, it seems like the Bible's pretty clear about who Jesus is. It's pretty clear about who God is. It's pretty clear about what happened to the Jews when they were in the desert. It's pretty clear about the New Testament. Where did Paul go? It's pretty clear. You pull your map out, right, and you can follow it all over the place, some of his missionary voyages. But you come to the age of the earth, and it's like, it's just an explosion of pieces all over the place. And I think this is part of the explanation. Maybe you can come up with some other things. But I think, first of all, the problem is the Hebrew that we're going to look at tonight. We're not going to read Hebrew, but I mean the translations. But Hebrew is a really primitive language, right? The Old Testament language. They have something like 7,000 words, which sounds like a lot until you put it up against English. It's somewhere, nobody can tell because it keeps sucking more words in all the time. So it's just growing exponentially, but it's somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million words. So when you want to say something, you've got this wide choice, right? You don't just say he walked in the room. Maybe he sauntered. Maybe he stomped. Maybe he, right? You probably think of 30 words for how people walk, because English is so beautiful to give us all these choices. But Hebrew doesn't have those choices. I'm going to show you later on how that's going to play a role in how you interpret Noah's flood. Right? It seems obvious. It sounds worldwide, doesn't it? If you've read the story of Noah's flood, I'm going to give you an alternate way to take a look at that, and it's not cheating, right? It's just the Hebrew language is so minimal. There are a lot of words, like the word day. All right, we're going to land on the word day in a few minutes here. The word day has so many different meanings. Yeah, Dan?
I've also understood that by the time they actually wrote out the Hebrew Bible in written form, as a whole, and I forgot what the book was called at that point. It was like maybe 250 years or so before Christ.
Yeah, Septuagint.
Well, no, Septuagint was the Greek translation of the.
Oh, okay. You mean earlier than that?
Yeah, the first Hebrew, Old Bible. No, I forgot anyway. But at that point, I've heard that a lot of the words that they didn't really remember, they didn't really know what they meant. In other words, the scholars who wrote that down had some confusion on even what some of the words actually meant. In other words, there was a little bit of dissension between them on what.
I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
If you find a book or an article, let me know. I'd like this. Question? Yeah.
Well, the Hebrew didn't have vowel points, right? They didn't have
Right.
vowels. So if you have RD, it could be read, R-E-A-D, or read, R-E-E-D,
Yeah.
or ride, or it's all by context.
Yeah, Lord would be L-R-D. And you can get close. But yeah, so you're dealing with a language that's... there aren't a lot of words for you to express what you want to express. I think the second point up there is something that we probably thought about, but maybe not given a name to it. But the Bible is really understated, isn't it? It often will not give you, for example, physical descriptions of people. Right? What did these people look like? I don't know. Abraham meets God, and God talks to Abraham out in the desert. How'd that happen? Was it in his head? Was it an actual voice? What's Abraham thinking as he's talking to God in the middle of the night or something? We don't know. God says, go kill your son. And so he goes back to his home and takes Isaac the next morning. What, did he talk to Sarah? Yeah, we're going to go out. We're going to have a busy day tomorrow. We're going to go kill your son. It's like, what? I mean, there's a lot of that we don't know, right? It's called understated. The Bible doesn't give us much information, as much as we want, maybe. That's just the way it's written. That's just the style. It's kind of a stripped down language there. Very concrete and basic stuff. Jim?
You have to remember, too, that the Bible writers had to express it in a way that the people around them could understand it.
Yeah.
They couldn't get pretty highly technical because only one person out of 10 could understand what they were talking about.
Yeah, that's true, too. Translation problems, obviously going from one language to another is always difficult. If you took any language when you were young, you know what that was like. It's a different culture, right? This is not Western world stuff, right? This is ancient Near East, ANE, very difficult time period to talk about. And the Bible's primarily a religious text, and it's not there to be a scientific text. It touches on science, sure, but that's not the primary goal of it, to become a scientific textbook. And frankly, and this is the part that really hurts, is our egos get in the way. Right? We stake out a position and then we throw the bombs at the other positions, right? Because we've now committed ourselves to this thing, and it's hard to say, I'm not sure. Nobody wants to say, I'm not sure. It's like, yeah, I'm right, you're wrong. And the finger starts pointing, right? And the veins start standing up. Let me give you an example of what we're talking about here as far as people say, well, I read the Bible literally. Oh, really? Right? You're not reading it literally, so there's something wrong with you. Well, how about verses like this? 1 Chronicles 16:13, the world is established, it shall never be moved. Echoed in Psalm 93, the world is established, it shall never be moved. How about one more? Psalm 104. He set the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved. Let me stop at that point. People, this looked good for a long time, didn't it? Because everybody thought there was an Earth-centered solar system, right? And the stars and the sun and the moon and everything went around us, right? Because they're all moving. Right? It seems obvious. We're not going anywhere, right? You don't need a seatbelt. So we're not going anywhere. Everything's going around us, and the people who are sacred, interested in religious texts, would look at this and say, yep. Until Copernicus and Galileo and some of those came along and said, no, we're moving. Right? It's heliocentric, not Earth-centered, right? So we are moving as well. So people, can you see what's going on here? People had to kind of rethink these Bible verses. So my guess is, and I don't want to spend a lot of time here trying to figure out exactly what's going on, but I have a feeling when it says the earth will never be moved, it's a different meaning than physically not moving. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Whereas, how about the next verse? That one strikes me as much more literal. Does it to you? He spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. Do you notice how that actually contradicts the previous verse, doesn't it? Because it says he set the earth on foundations. If you want to be literal, you're talking very large concrete structures. Ka-choom, there goes the earth. Well, that's not what he meant. That's not what God's talking about. So we as Christians had to kind of rethink, because of what was going on as we discovered things out in nature, we kind of had to rethink how we were interpreting the Bible verses. By the way, that first part on that Job 26 is pretty interesting. It says he spreads out the skies over empty space. That's the Big Bang, I think. Now, there are all sorts of verses in Isaiah and Job that talk about him stretching out the heavens. That's kind of interesting, right? It's what they think is going on today. The universe fabric is actually being pulled apart. Right? The universe is expanding into what? I don't know, but it's expanding. So I think that's interesting. But does that make sense as far as just the idea of the literal figurative thing that people talk about? I mean, sometimes we look at a Bible verse and we do need the science to begin to figure out exactly what was being said here.
It's poetry.
It's poetry, you're right. Which we're going to come back to, too. Anyway, here are the 5 views that we're going to talk about tonight. And obviously we're going to have to go fairly quickly over them. I'll spend more time on some, especially the first 2, because you're probably more familiar with those, and those seem to get the most press. And frankly, they're the ones that seem to clash the most. Sometimes called young earth, the other called day age or old earth. Theistic evolution, we'll talk about that one. I'm not going to spend much time on the analogic. It's okay. I mean, it gets you off the hook scientifically if you like that, so we'll get to that one. And then there's a last one here that I hadn't heard about until about 2 years ago. It's called the framework theory. I said, what? And I started reading about it. I've got a little video clip, I hope we have time for at the end here. Greg Kokel of Stand to Reason is actually going to talk a little bit about that. And so it's a different way to think about Genesis as well. So let's do this. We'll talk about every one of these 5. What does it stand for? What does it mean? We'll talk about where they're getting the idea, look at Bible verses and things like that. And we'll talk about some of the weaknesses. Each of them has a weakness. So again, I'm trying to be fair. I'm not trying to push a particular position off on anybody here. So young earth creationism. God is creating in 6 consecutive 24-hour periods of time. In other words, a literal week of work there. And the earth is young. But the universe, you see my parentheses there, not all young earthers say that the whole universe is young. They say, maybe it's billions of years old, but then God stepped in for the earth and did a creating act just a few thousand years ago. They believe Noah's flood covered the whole earth. That's called catastrophism. So when you look out and you see the Grand Canyon, you see these huge mountains raised up, you see all these odd things, seashells sitting up on the top of a mountain someplace. They said it was Noah's flood that did that, right? It did the quick carving of canyons and things like that. I mentioned Calvin and Luther. I want to share something with you here. This is Sharon's Bible from high school. She got it for graduation in high school. And I find it really fascinating. On the first page of Genesis here, it has, the text up here. I'm sorry, the text is here. And this got a little center column that tells you where you can go for other verses and all. And at the top, Genesis 1, it says BC 4004. This is called a Schofield Reference Bible. Now, if you're old enough, I see Louise nodding. Sorry. But if you've been around a while, I grew up on the Schofield, right? And probably some of you recognize that. Mark's nodding his head over there, too. So I don't know what happened, but a guy named Schofield came along about 1900 and put together a reference Bible. And so he got to put his own comments in there. And he bought into this guy named Usher, who was an old Irish priest back in, I think, the 1600s maybe, late 1600s. He sat down, I guess really bored one day. They worked the genealogies backwards as far as he could. So-and-so lived 500 years, so-and-so lived 300 years. So he's working this backwards. And he says 4004 BC. In fact, he had the date down. It was October. So we're coming up to the birthday of the earth. So, maybe we should have a party or something, get our party hats out. But so he says 4004 BC. So Schofield grabs that number, 4004, and the evangelical world kind of bought into the Schofield Bible, and this is all over the place, right? It's not just our church, but this is a very popular reference Bible. And so I think that helped spread the idea of a young earth. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm just saying it was kind of interesting how that happened, huh? George Price wrote something in the 1920s called a book called New Geology, trying to contradict what's called uniformitarianism. There's a mouthful, huh? But uniformitarianism is the idea that the Grand Canyon, over millions of years, the sand goes and it just kind of keeps carving it down, and nothing huge happens, right? The mountains slowly rise and the valleys slowly sink, and Yosemite takes, millions of years as the glacier comes and the water starts dropping over. So he was contradicting that, saying, no, new geology, right? It was all because of the flood, the Noah's flood. Henry Morris ends up popularizing this then in the 60s and all. And right down here, about 30 miles south of us, was the headquarters for Henry Morris's group called the Institute for Creation Research, ICR. And they became kind of the spark plug for the whole young earth thing, right in our backyard. And so if you grew up in Southern California, I bet your church or a youth pastor or somebody was probably influenced by ICR. They started a museum in Santee, and they have since moved. Their organization is in Dallas now. And I think they sold the museum to some other young earth organization. But you can... What's that?
Tom Cantor.
Tom Cantor.
Oh, okay.
Friendship with God, Tom Cantor, the Creation Earth Museum.
Oh, okay. All right.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, and so some of you have gone. I think the youth group. Is that right, Steve? Were you part of that? Did you guys?
Yeah, we went to some.
You went down. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's close. You can go take a look at that if you want.
It's actually expanded just a lot, and they start talking about other things rather than just the creation.
Just the age of the
They
earth.
talk about biology and things like that.
Oh, good.
It's
Getting
actually
into
really
the
interesting.
anatomy of man and a lot of scientific stuff.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah,
Oh,
they
good.
added a big section to it.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting.
Oh, good. Well, here are at least two people that you might recognize. Henry Morris has since passed away. His son John took over the organization, and then his kids are involved. So it's a real family kind of thing. The man on the right you may recognize as Kim Ham. He had a debate a couple of years back, I guess, with Bill Nye, the bow tie guy. I think Bill Nye chewed him up, but then that's maybe my opinion. I was kind of cringing. I think there would have been better people to debate Bill Nye, because Bill Nye is not really that sharp a guy. You could have knocked him apart, I think. But anyway, so where are they getting their support? Well, the Bible, primarily, right? Genesis 1 and 2, the creation sure sounds like days, doesn't it? There's evening and morning. That was the second day, and the evening and morning, there's the third day. They do the genealogies, right? They'll say things like, well, see, Adam lived 130 years, had a son, so he lived another 800, so you add those up, you got 930, and you just keep working those genealogies, and if you get enough of them, you can at least make a guess, time period-wise, as far as thousands of years in the past. We're going to talk about the flood account a little bit later. They go to Exodus 20. That's where they're giving the Ten Commandments, and God says, remember the Sabbath, 6 days you shall labor, for in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth. So they say, see, right? We're supposed to be on the same program as what God did. We work 6 days, He worked 6 days. Another big one for them is Romans 5:12. Paul's talking about sin here. He says, sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. In this way, death came to all men. So any ideas, if some of you have read this before, you probably know, but any ideas how they're going to connect this to a young earth? This verse in Romans.
Animals died.
Yeah. They'll say, look what it says here. Death, right? I'm just reading it. Death came through sin. So until you had people, there was no death. So then you can't have those millions of years of dinosaurs tearing each other apart and pterodactyls flying around, knocking each other off, and animal death and plant death. You can't have all that stuff. If you read Romans, literally, because it says, I'm just reading again, death entered the world through one man, death through sin. So it throws out the whole dinosaur thing. So you've got to have death starting with Adam. What about scientific support? Well, less than the Bible support. They'll say things like comets can't keep going around forever. Every time a comet comes by, it loses some of its material to the sun. Right? That's why it gets that nice tail. So you can't have a comet lasting millions of years. They'll say there's not enough seafloor sediment that settles out to account for millions of years of the Earth. The magnetic field appears to be decaying. They say it can't have been around as long as scientists say. They think radiometric dating and carbon dating is off. They have a lot of reasons for that. They think there was a different set of physical laws before the fall. Here are some of the problems with it, and we'll see some more of this when we talk about old Earth as well. For one thing, day 6, if you read day 6, there's sure a lot going on there. It doesn't seem like you could pull all that off in just 24 hours. Because Adam is created, and then Adam tends the garden, then Adam names all the animals, and Adam's pretty busy. And then Eve gets created, and he says, as he looks at Eve, he says, at last. Well, if the guy's only been around, 8-10 hours, it seems odd to say at last. By the way, take a look at your Bible sometime. The part where Eve is brought before Adam is done as a poem. Right? The rest of Genesis is not really set up. It doesn't look like Psalms, for example. So I used to tell my class, I said, check it out. This is the first poem in the Bible, and it's a love song. It's Adam saying, I like that. What do you call that? Woman. Okay, I like that. So it's a Hallmark card, right? It's the first Hallmark card. I love you. At last. You're in my life. How about another day where vegetation is brought? It says, let the land produce vegetation. That doesn't sound like a 24-hour period, does it? I mean, to produce, it takes time to grow stuff. It lacks scientific support. Let me jump ahead one slide and show you what I'm talking about. John Morris, I told you he's the son of Henry Morris. He was interviewed on a radio station one time up in Los Angeles. He was asked if he or any of his associates ever met or even just heard of a scientist who had become a young earther based on scientific evidence rather than the Bible? And he said no. That's pretty honest. They asked Dwayne Gish, who was also a pretty big name. He used to go around and debate people all over the place, ask him the same question. Do you know of anybody who has been swayed by the scientific evidence to become a young earther? And he said no. So, let me go back. There's an appearance of age problem, isn't there? They find ice cores that go way down that they'll dig out, and it looks like hundreds of thousands of years of these ice cores. The coral, it takes coral a long, long time to do its thing, and they can check that, and they can check those things. Geology, right? The dating of all these rocks and all that kind of stuff. There's kind of a concern there, and the light coming from stars, there's a concern that it makes God appear to be a trickster of some kind, right? He's made everything look really, really old. What would be the point of that, to make everything look that old? Right, so that may be a problem. Have you ever thought about this? It actually requires a speeded up evolution, more so than even the evolutionists would buy into. So let's think about that for a minute. So you got this big ark, and Noah says, come on, he's got 2 cats, right? So 2 cats are on board. Every other cat in the world is wiped out, right? Because it's universal flood. Isn't that why they're taking the animals on there? So he's got 2 cats, and let's say this is 10,000 years ago, right? We'll give him a lot of time. So he's got 10,000 years. So at the end of the flood is over, and he opens the door and says, shoot. And these 2 cats go out, they got 10,000 years to turn into jaguars and tigers and lions and ocelots, and that's a lot of quick evolutionary changing going on, right? That's faster than evolutionists. They would say, it took millions of years to get these animals, so all of a sudden, you got to crank that clock really fast to get those 2 and 2 and 2 animals to hurry up and change and become all the dogs and all the cats and all the birds and all the other things that we have.
Wasn't there reproduction and stuff going on the ark or anything? I mean, that was a pretty big space. And
well, you have like a half a year or something like that. So, I mean, you couldn't produce a lot of animals in that time. Is that what you're thinking? Maybe they produced enough.
Yeah, but there's still, I think, a variety that we may not be aware of.
Maybe. I don't know. I'm just saying this could be a problem for that view. Day can have many meanings. Right, that's a biggie. We talked about that a little bit before. Genesis 2:4, right in the Genesis account of the creation, says this: in the day the Lord made the earth and the heavens. In the day, I thought it was 6. So apparently this is not meaning the 24-hour period, right? It means the extended time period that God created. So that's a little bit different. And still, in Genesis 2:17, in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Did they die the day they ate it? No. God fashioned skins for them, and He turned them loose, and they had a tough life, right? But it wasn't the day. So apparently they're not using day as tick-tock, 24 hours again. There's no morning or evening to the 7th day. Take a look at the Genesis account. Morning and evening, morning and evening, morning and evening, but not when you get to the 6th, to the 7th day. And in fact, if you read Hebrews 4, it says there that God's still in that 7th day. So that 7th day for sure is thousands of years. So that seems to question maybe, why the other days just days. Okay, any thoughts before, crazy question, I suppose. Yeah, Tracy.
I was in an online conversation within the last several days with a young earther, and he pointed me to an online article, the Young Earth website, and I've done a lot of homework and a lot of research, but one of the things that he emphasized right off the top was what he called the plain meaning of Scripture. And it was all about reading it at face value and so forth. And as you read it at face value, here's why a Young Earth argument is supported. Well, the problem there is if you focus on a quote-unquote plain meaning, well then it's plain that the sun and the earth weren't created until the 4th day. So how could you measure your days before the sun and moon were created? And so you've got a little difficulty there.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? You don't get the sun and the moon until day 4.
So that whole thing then about a universal flood and the waters coming away rapidly, which would create these layers of sediment and animals and everything trapped. That's not validated. I mean, that's not a good reason for it.
No, they'll talk about that as support. Yeah. If you're talking about the young Earth position, yeah.
Well, that is a good reason because the fossils end up on top of mountains too.
Yeah. Right.
All over the world.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Okay, let's just because. Oh, sorry, we'll do one more quick
I'm
comment.
just thinking, one of the real issues is the power of God. What can He do, and what is necessary? I mean, did he? If you go back to like a theistic evolution, He just started it, and then it had to take off all by itself. So the real question is, what is the hand of God in creation?
Right.
Did He say, well, I'm going to take 1,000,000 years to make this butterfly, or and say, okay, now in the next 1,000,000, we do have some time constraints that He has to deal with to have a world that has oxygen, a world that has all these things. I know what people say about there's no sun. He said God's the sun. He doesn't need the sun to bring light. He doesn't need an orbit or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I've heard that comeback that God was the light at the time. Let's take a look at old Earth creationism. It believes the Earth is billions of years old, and that God, though, needed to step in periodically and insert new pieces of information, right? Because we learned last week with Steve, you can't get new information. It's just, there's too much complexity to be able to just have these things happenstance. So God comes in and intervenes and creates these advanced beings as He goes through time. They are not evolutionists, though, who buy into this, right? Evolution says God didn't step in at all. It was just all done through accidents, through freaks of nature, through genetic mutations, natural selection, totally unguided. That's the evolutionary perspective. So sometimes the old earthers get accused of being evolutionists. They absolutely are not. They say you can't get something turning into something else without an input of information that's supplied by God. Church creeds never made a big deal about it. It was actually fairly popular before the 20th century among evangelicals. Hugh Ross is probably the real major popularizer of that, starting in the 1980s. Here are a couple of people that are associated with it. The man on the left is Hugh Ross. He's been to this church, and it was interesting. We had 3 weeks. They may still have some of the CDs available of the talk. You could check, I guess, with the Manual of Faith. But they had Greg Kokel speak on why he was not an evolutionist, like Steve talked about last week. And then Hugh Ross came in and gave the old Earth perspective. The following week, Gary Mortensen came in and did a young Earth perspective. So I thought that was pretty gutsy of the church to be willing to, in a sense, deal with an issue that can get kind of hot. They were willing to say, look, we have differences within the body of Christ, so let's hear them both. The person on the right is William Lane Craig. He's a really well-known debater, one of the sharpest guys, just an amazing intellect. And so these two would be in the old Earth column. What kind of support do they have? Well, I'll go over these fairly quickly. Some of we already talked a little bit about. But the idea of evening and morning, are we talking literal again, evening and morning? Because sometimes we don't. Psalm 30 says, weeping may remain for a night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. We're not really talking about a particular period of time. It sounds like just, there are tough times you go through, and then there are good times that you go through. Day 3 talked about the land producing. The meaning of day varied. We already talked about that. The Hebrews 4 passage. They believe Noah's flood is local. And so we'll get into that in just a couple of minutes. Romans 5:12 is interesting. If we go back, if you don't mind, I hope you don't get dizzy here. Okay, there's Romans 5:12. Let's read it one more time, and let's think about it now from maybe a slightly different perspective. Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. In this way, death came to what? Dinosaurs? What does it say? Death came to men. Right? And so we're talking a spiritual death there. So a lot of people interpret this very differently. They say, you can have all the animal death you want, then the human race comes along, they sin, and death comes to them as a result. Right? They've broken that connection with God. There's spiritual death involved. Right? They need rescuing at that point. There's our major problem, right? The fall of the human race. And it says, in this way, death came to all men. It doesn't say death, for the first time, death came to animals. It doesn't say that. It says death came to all men. Okay, so let me take you back to where we were here. Something else about the genealogies. For They challenge Usher and people like that. They say in the genealogies, remember we have a limited vocabulary, right, with the Hebrew? So when they say so-and-so is the father of, and the father of, and the father of, in Hebrew it can mean is in the line of, right? So your great-great-great-grandfather, if you're talking in Hebrew days, he'd be your dad. Well, he's not your dad, right? There's dozens and dozens of years that have gone by, hundreds of years maybe. So it's hard to pin a genealogy down because of that stretched view of who's a real parent. Take a look sometime at the genealogy of Jesus, right? People are left out of that stretch because it says so-and-so was the son of so-and-so was the son of, But take a look at that sometime and do some study on that. And apparently it goes way back, and Matthew skipped over some people. Old Earth support, a lot of science. I think just because of time I'm going to keep moving, but the Big Bang, the way stars burn at a certain speed, right? It takes them a long time to go through their gases and get themselves in trouble that way. I mentioned the ice deposits and coral layers. And it seems like all the fields of science agree the Earth is old, whether it's geology or whether it's astronomy or it's biology or it's cosmology, right? It all seems to say it's 13 billion years old for the universe, and what are they up to? 3 point something or 4 point something for the Earth? 4 billion? 4.5, something like that. Okay, let's look. I thought this might be interesting to show you the difference in the wording. So I'm going to read, and I bolded a few words here. I'm going to read you the account of Noah, and we're going to come back to that. Well, anyway, I'm explaining more than I needed to. So Genesis 7:17 to 24. For 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 20 feet. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. Doesn't that sound worldwide? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I grew up on. I mean, look at that language there. It's the earth, and it's the heavens, and the mountains are covered. And the mountains are covered 20 feet, right? Over the highest of the mountains, 20 feet. Okay, here we go, though. Hebrew is a limited language. So when you see the word earth up there, you're just as, it's fair to say land. It means the same thing. It's the same Hebrew word. The word mountains for the Hebrews could be a hill. And heavens can be sky. So, with that in mind, let's try it again. This time I'm going to substitute those words out. So this would be the young earth view of the Noah flood. Here's the old earth view. For 40 days the flood kept coming on the land, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the land. The waters rose and increased greatly on the land, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the land, and all the high hills on the entire sky were covered. The waters rose more than 20 feet. That's very different. And it's an equally correct translation there. Not to say it covered the mountains over 20 feet higher than the mountains. You can also say the waters rose more than 20 feet. And the hills were covered. Every living thing that moved on the land perished. Every living thing on the face of the land was wiped out. The waters flooded the land for 150 days. So here we go, right? If you saw this translation, you might be a little more hesitant to say worldwide, right? I mean, it could be local because the Mesopotamian area is pretty flat there, and they get these sudden floods. They've got evidence of floods there. And if that's where your civilization is, if that's where the human race is, do you really need to flood the Andes? Do you really need to flood Canada? Do you really need to flood South Africa? There are no people there. You're angry at the people, right? You're taking them out. And so that's the other interpretation. I'm not saying which one's right. I'm just saying it's kind of frustrating because the language is so limited that it could mean either of these things. Yeah.
Why would Noah need the ark then?
Well, if you got a 20-foot wave of water, I don't know. People die in really small floods around here.
But I mean, if the flood if it was localized, why would he have to have an ark with all of these animals if the animals could survive?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what they mean necessarily when they say localized. It may not be like 50 square miles. I mean, it could be hundreds of square miles, but they just don't think it was worldwide. What's that?
Local meaning could be continental.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's ever got it down to how big that would be. See?
The judgment was upon humankind and the animals that were in contact with humans. So those were under judgment, so those were to perish in a more limited sense. And so the ark then took the animals that weren't under judgment, that weren't in contact with humans, and why they had an ark, that's a good. It's a good question.
It is.
That would be a weakness in that view.
Yeah.
But I think that the main judgment was humanity, and why go beyond humanity? Humanity was in a small area, so why flood the entire earth if humanity's in a small area?
Yeah. Alan?
Geologists and a bunch of the other people are doing research to try and figure out what the flood could have been. They're looking at, it's like the gates of Gibraltar collapsed and the ocean came in, or the strait between the Black Sea collapsed and the ocean came in. So it could have been a huge area that was flooding. I mean, it's like the whole Mediterranean is filling up at one time. It's going to be a big mess. So 150 days where you've got water 20 feet deep above, highest land around you.
Yeah.
You're going to have something to survive that.
You know what I think is interesting is there are other flood stories in the world. It's not just the Bible. Babylonians have a story, and you can read it today. Right? And it's the same kind of thing. Flood, and then a little select group of people are saved.
Does it relate to this story, though? I mean, isn't that what they've tried to say over time, that many civilizations have a story like this that would maybe tie in that?
It sounds like something catastrophic happened. Yeah. I mean, it's in the memory of a whole lot of people.
A lot of them use it to discount the Bible. They say, their flood story is older than the Bible flood story. What I was going to say was, I think I've read that they believe that all the continents were basically connected at one point, the Pangea or whatever they called it, right? And at that time, there wasn't a lot of mountains, and there wasn't a lot of... Except
that was millions and millions of years.
I'm saying a young earther could argue that was the case at the time, and then, and also it said in Genesis that, at that time it hadn't rained, and the earth gave up the water too, and it didn't just rain down.
Yeah. Right, there were springs and things.
Springs came up from underneath, so all these changes could be happening at the same time, and that's an argument.
And Morris's canopy, that was around the fresh earth, protecting and keeping the radiation out, deteriorated as part of that judgment and this whole thing. So.
So scientifically, when do they say a flood would occur? When did they say the flood occurred?
You mean,
because then it gives us some reference point.
As far as dating, you mean?
Yeah, as far as dating.
I don't know.
Nobody's got a date for it.
Yeah. Long time ago. Okay, some of the problems with the old Earth. Obviously, the old Earth position has kind of hooked itself into modern science, right? So if that changes, and we know science is changing all the time, if that current idea of radiometric dating or whatever, if that goes out the window, then it makes this one look a little shaky. And the concern is that it makes the Bible elastic. You don't really mean day, you mean period of time. You're kind of pulling on the Bible so that you can make it fit there. And it seems to go against the literal meaning of the text. Darren?
Did they kind of discover that the original radiocarbon dating isotopes were not constant all the way down, so now they're using other isotopes to date things? I mean, is that true?
I haven't heard. I don't know.
Yeah.
Alan?
They're pretty consistent. They have found that the carbon-14 in salt water will leach out, so it throws off their dating. They found that if it's in forest where you have acid soil because of the trees and the peat all working on it, it will leach out more of the carbon-14, so you get skewed results. There's a number of things that will throw it off.
Yeah.
So for them to make it work, the thing is, you'll look at the whole thing.
They're comparing it to other isotopes and other elements.
Other isotopes. Where do we find it in the rock?
Yeah.
Because you can drill a core down, but you may be drilling into a sinkhole, and it's going to throw the whole dirt column off. So there's all kinds of things that throw it off. So they say, okay, we've got to look at everything to come to some kind of conclusion.
Okay, let's try to keep it on a more general level here, because we're going to get into all the weeds, right? And I got about 15, 20 minutes here, so I still got 3 to go. Steve?
The word literal, you've heard Mark Strauss talk about it. He says, throw the word literal out.
Yeah.
There is no literal interpretation of the Bible.
Yeah.
There are multiple meanings, and by the context, you arrive at the meaning. But he says that word literal is overused and abused, and Mark says, throw it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if somebody asks you, do you believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible? Don't answer them. They're going to try to nail you.
And I've already touched on this, but before we leave the whole controversy here, they're in so much agreement. You know, it's a shame that a lot of heat gets generated because they don't believe, neither side, right? The young earth, the old earth, they don't believe in Darwinian evolution. They say God was involved in every step of the process. They're evangelical, good Christians in each camp of this. Neither one says there's enough time for evolution to operate. They believe Adam and Eve are real people. And they're considered within Christian orthodoxy, so we need a lot of grace and kindness to each other. So let's just take a look at the third major one that's starting to really gather steam, and it's called theistic evolution. And the reason it's gathering steam, well, probably a lot of reasons, but one is that the guy, I'll introduce him in a second, the guy who kind of sparked this thing and got it going, he's got an organization called the Templeton Fund behind him, and they have invested hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars so that he can go to conferences, they can present things at Christian colleges and other colleges. They have a beautiful website now, and so this thing is actually into, I think I mentioned there's Christian universities. If you've got kids thinking about going to school and you don't like this position, call up the biology department. Just say, where do you stand as far as creation and all go? And they may say, yeah, we believe in creation. Well, maybe. It kind of depends, right? They may be theistic evolutionists. It's really a growing trend across campuses. So what do they say? They say that God set up the natural laws. But then, I think somebody else mentioned that earlier, God allowed natural selection to do its thing and all, and he knew how it was all going to turn out. But he's kind of the God behind the screen. So he's not actively involved. He started with a molecule and let it go. And he had it worked out in such a way so those molecules adapted and changed and turned into small life, turned into more complex life, and we're at the top of the heap now. So they really buy into evolution, basically. They said God's behind it. Which means that chapters 1 and 2 in Genesis are not really historical documents. And God works in ways that you can't really see it. It's like it's kind of behind the screen, as I was saying. However, they do believe in Jesus in the New Testament, that those are legit and that Jesus really came, he really died for their sins. So they're still in the orthodoxy circle as far as Christianity goes. Here's the guy who's the head person behind this. You probably recognize his name, Francis Collins. He was the head of the Human Genome Project, and now, I think right now, he's director of the National Institute of Health. And he said this: the evidence supporting the idea that all living things are descended from a common ancestor is truly overwhelming. Right? So he thinks the evidence is there for evolution. I would not necessarily wish that to be so as a Bible-believing Christian, but it is so. It does not serve faith well to try to deny that. So he has hitched his wagon to evolution. He says the proof is there, which is interesting because he's clashing with everything Steve talked about last week. I think this guy's wrong. I hate to jump on my own opinion here, but I think he's hitching his wagon to something that's starting to go off the track, if I can keep the metaphor going. Dan?
I think you can also read that, though. The evidence supporting the idea of all living things really was focused on man to begin with because of the probabilities of the diversity that evolution would have in the human genome doesn't exist. The similarities between all races ever worked on throughout all historical data and all present members of the earth is in such a tight fit that it is impossible in probability for it to be that way if they weren't descended from the same man.
Okay,
so there's a that syncopation. You could try to separate out the animal kingdom from man, but in man's regard, it shows that we are truly in one family orientation.
Yeah.
Do you think he may be looking at that, kind of blinders from the DNA standpoint, that, somehow our DNA sort of looks like it comes from a common...
See, that's what's interesting. I want to play with that for just a minute here. some of the problems with this theistic evolution. The first one is we're in the time period, and Steve talked about it. The proof, quote unquote, for evolution seems to be evaporating. And I'll give you just one example. Collins, in his book, it's called The Language of God. It's a really interesting book. You'd probably like it. You just have to, when you get to the theistic evolution part, you just have to kind of bite your tongue a little bit. But he says in there, junk DNA is proof that evolution occurred because you've got these dead ends inside our DNA. In other words, our DNA is instructions for building us. But there seemed to be, at least when he first came up with this idea, there seemed to be some dead ends, things that don't produce anything in the human race, as if there were some genetic mutations and they didn't pan out, but we're still hanging on to them in our DNA. So he says, see, junk DNA. Well, I'm sure some of you are aware of this. There's this thing called the ENCODE project just a few years ago, and guess what they found? There ain't no such thing as junk DNA. They said, stop using that word. You're done. There's no junk DNA. So Francis Collins has had to back off of that. He thought that was just wonderful proof that evolution had happened. So I'm thinking, wow, he's already seeing some of the support you can start to give on him here. So we'll see what happens to the rest of it.
And the quote was at least 10 years old, too.
What's that?
The date that was on there.
Oh, that quote of his.
Was 10 years
yeah,
old.
exactly. And by the way, scientists disregard this theistic evolution. They think it's kind of a joke and roll their eyes because evolution to them is not theistic at all. It's unguided, right? There's no God. You're just throwing the dice enough times and you get all these things. You don't need a God behind this. So it's kind of like they're cloaking God over it to say, yeah, it's really God involved. And you got some biblical problems. If Adam and Eve aren't real, then we don't have a real fall. Right? And Jesus and Paul talked about Adam and Eve as if they were real. Paul says, as you know, Adam did this, and we got the new Adam now. Jesus is the new Adam. But you don't have an Adam and Eve because you just got things turning into humans, kind of slowly. So there's not that one time period where God comes in and creates the human race. It's just that evolutionary process. So there's no Genesis 1 and 2 on a literal level, I guess. Let me do number 4 real fast. It's called the analogic. The days in Genesis are a 6-to-1 ratio, and that's the way we're supposed to live our lives. It was just patterning, right? It was just 6-to-1. You work 6 days, take a day off. God did the same thing. Done. So there's no science. You don't have to worry about science. So you can sit there and argue about radiometric dating or whatever. It's like, doesn't matter. It was just told to us as an analogy. It's just a story with an analogy. Of course, the problem with that is it doesn't make Genesis literal again, does it? It's just numbers. Number game being played there. So I'm going to go past that one because that one doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but there are some people that buy into it. I do like this last one, though. It's called the framework theory. I don't mean I'm in that camp necessarily, but I just find it really interesting. Here's the deal. I guess I like it because it's kind of literary perspective on Genesis. Here's what it says. It says, you got sets of things going on in these days. Day 1 actually matches up with day 4. Day 2 matches up with 5, and day 3 matches up with 6. And you say, well, how is that possible? I think it's going to be easier if you see this little chart here. On days 1, 2, and 3, God is establishing kingdoms, right? It's a domain. He's established a domain, and in 4, 5, and 6, he populates those domains. So, on day 1, he creates this, what is it, day 1, day and night. So he establishes day and night, but he doesn't have the sun and the stars and the moon yet. That comes on day 4. So there's your parallel of those two. Day 2 is the sky, and you fill it with birds. On day 5, day 3 is the land. You fill it with animals that walk on the land and humans. And so it's a parallelism that's going on. It's not trying to tell you a chronological story. It's a theological story, not chronology at all. Or if you like it like this, if that gives you a better picture of it, light and dark on day 1, day 4, you fill it up. Day 2, the sea and the sky are created, filled up on 5, 3, and 6. And you may say, well, gosh, this sounds pretty fancy literary stuff. What's going on here? Well, there are all sorts of bizarre, interesting little things if you dig under the surface, like numbers. Numbers play a big role in the Bible, right? The number 40 is huge, isn't it? Number 40 is in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. You know, in the original Hebrew, in Genesis 1:1, it's made of 7 words. Why the number 7, do you think? That's perfect, right? That's God's number. So now you get multiples of that. If you look at Genesis 1 and 2, it's made of 14, multiple of 7. God, the word God is used 35 times, another multiple of 7, in the creation account. And you go, well, maybe that's an accident. No, there are all sorts of these little hidden things all through the Bible. Let me take you to one other place. I don't think I have the time to read this whole thing, but you remember the story of the Tower of Babel? Okay, so you and I read it, and we just go, okay, it's a nice story, done. But people that are really into the literary framework kind of stuff, this sort of parallel structure, say, there's something going on here. It's called a chiasm, C-H-I-A-S-M, chiasm. It's a literary term. Here's what it means. Here's the story again, but this time I'm breaking it down into the kinds of literature going on there. So the very beginning you get a narrative, right? It's just something is taking place. Then you go to dialogue, right? See the quotation marks? The people are saying things to each other. And then in the middle, it's the hinge. That's where God shows up. It's like, okay, everybody out of the pool. And then you go to dialogue, that's God talking. And then you go to narrative. What do you notice about that structure? It's a reverse structure. It's like a ladder or something, but it's a mirror image, right? This part mirrors that one, and the bottom mirrors the top one. That's not the only place. It's all through the Old Testament. And so I'm just amazed. I just love the Old Testament because people go zipping past that stuff. And I've seen books that tell you all these different chiasms. There's something literarily interesting. God has allowed the writers of the Old Testament and the New Testament amazing creativity, right? I mean, people weren't sitting there just automatically writing, saying, I wonder what God has to say here. I mean, God's allowed. It's not like the Quran at all, where it's like dictation. I mean, the creativity is just amazing to me. Now, Michael?
Is there a reference for this information? Is there a book that talks about the framework?
I don't have it with me here, but I'll give you a book title in just a second. Of course, there's a problem with that, right? And probably some of you are feeling that right here. It turns it into poetry, and you're going, what about Adam and Eve again? Okay, that might be the problem. It seems to dilute the reality of the story. I understand that. Give me about, are we okay for about 4 or 5 minutes here? Okay, but remember, you guys can always go over and get something to eat or drink. Greg Kokel, who is Steve and I, he's our hero. We like Greg Kokel's stuff. But Greg is talking about this framework idea, and he presents another angle on it, and I'll tell you the book in just a second that he's referring to. But he is suggesting it may not be about science. So here's what Kokel has to say.
I want to talk about some thinking I've been doing about Genesis 1. And I have said frequently on the radio as people ask me, what do I think is going on there in Genesis 1? That it's a lot easier to say what did not happen than what actually did happen. And what did not happen was materialistic Darwinian evolution. And this is something I've opposed consistently. When I say Darwinian evolution, I mean the neo-Darwinian synthesis or macroevolution. However, zeroing in on exactly how we're to understand Genesis chapter 1 and 2 has been problematic. And basically, there are two sides to the issue. One is the young Earth creationists, and then there's the old Earth intelligent design crowd. And characteristically, each has tried to interpret the text in light of that paradigm. I think they're all doing making a good faith effort and doing good work, trying to understand it in light of the additional scientific facts, if you will, as they understand them. So this isn't to put anybody down. I have the highest regard for people's efforts on both sides of the issue. But I've always felt that there was something else that was kind of missing here, and I've recently stumbled upon a treatment that got me thinking in a whole new way about Genesis chapter 1. By the way, everybody in play has a high view of Scripture too, inerrantists. So that's not the question. And the question, everyone that I'm thinking about also are against Darwinian evolution, so that isn't the option either. The option is, how are we to understand what God means to communicate in Genesis 1? And I've just been reading a book by two authors that are from Dallas Theological Seminary. I can't remember their names, but the book is called In the Beginning, We Misunderstood. I want to commend it to you just for your consideration. But it's got me thinking, because basically they are asking a foundational hermeneutical question. And that question is, how would the people the book was written to by the original writer have understood those writings? Well, that's a good question. That's the right place to start with any biblical question. So who was the original writer? Well, Moses was the original writer. That's the classic conservative understanding. If Moses was the original writer, then when did he write this? Well, this is the Pentateuch. It's the first of the 5 books. This is the first 5 books, and Genesis is the first of it, and Genesis is the book of beginnings. And so this must have been written after the Exodus and before conquering the land. Possibly during the time God was giving the law and before the wanderings. But what was it meant to do? Remember what was happening to the people to whom Moses was writing. They had been living for over 400 years in Egypt. They had very little connection theologically with their roots, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had been slaves for all of this time, and now God sends a deliverer, Moses, and Moses delivers them by showing that he is the true God through the 10 plagues and the deliverance through the Red Sea. Now Moses is educating them about the true God and about beginnings by contrast with the Egyptian cosmologies that they have been raised with in that culture. Now, in Egyptian cosmologies, parts of creation were gods, Ra, the sun god, for example, and a whole host of others, and many of the plagues. All of the plagues were actually against Egyptian gods, to show that the God of Israel was bigger than their gods. So in this accounting that we see in Genesis, what do we see? We see an accounting of how everything began. We see an accounting of the beginning of the problem and the beginning of the solution, which entails something important of the nation of Israel. And so the beginning starts in the beginning. Yahweh created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. That means it wasn't habitable, and there was nothing living in it. And then the rest of the first chapter explains how God organizes the habitation and populates it with things. But notice how he does it. He creates the lights, which are for seasons and days and things like that. The lights he created. They're not gods. They don't even have names in the Hebrew cosmology. They are just functionaries, that's all. They are not deities. Then he creates the animals, then he creates Adam and Eve, and it's not clear at all that the first 4 or 5 days are solar days. The sun is created late. Certainly doesn't seem that the 6th or the 7th day seem to be 24 hours. The 6th day is too long, and the 7th day is eternal. That's not the point of the passage. The point is more of a framework hypothesis showing that God is the one responsible for the order of the world, and all of these particulars are in sharp contrast to the Egyptian cosmology that the Jews have been raised with. Moses is saying, this is how...
Okay, well, he goes on another minute or two, but I just wanted to let you see that. Interesting idea, huh?
So he's saying that was written in that way to counter the Egyptian kind of beliefs.
Yeah. And again, he goes on to say it's not written to be a scientific document. We may not even think of it as a chronological document, like I said before, where that table was up there. It says it's a theological rather than a chronological accounting. Possibly. I mean, that's just another way to interpret it. You know, if we back off for just a second, I mean, the big picture here is pretty simple, isn't it? Instead of getting caught up in all this, hope your head's not hurting and spinning. But you either have a choice, right? In the beginning, the particles, or in the beginning, God. That's the big issue here. And the ideas that follow and the consequences that follow of this, you got to land one of those two places, right? There's no intermediate. And so when we send kids out to school, we can say, in the beginning, God. The method is kind of fuzzy, right, at this point. There are a lot of ways to interpret it, but we just don't want our kids landing in the other camp because they're rejecting the only thing we've told them, this has to be the way God did it. And they go, I don't think I buy into that now that I hear the science. So we don't want them to land in the beginning the particles. That says you have no purpose, you have no meaning. You're a fluke, the whole thing's a fluke. You're finished, you go on the ground, you got no free will, there's no morality. I mean, it all goes away if it's in the beginning the particles. So there's the big issue, if we were to back off of that. So what do? We need to teach our kids at least some of these options, because I think they're fascinating anyway. Kids like science, and so we can do that. Steve mentioned the other week we need to encourage people to know science, get involved, maybe reading the area of intelligent design, and for heaven's sake, showing grace to each other. It's we're going to have Christians that differ with us on this. And then how about some resources? One of the books is right here. That's the 3 Views on Creation and Evolution. That includes theistic evolution. The other one up the top, the Genesis debate, I think has the framework theory as one of the areas. Jim Wallace has a book called God's Crime Scene that looks at design in the universe. And then there's that book that Greg was referencing in the beginning, We Misunderstood. It's a man named Miller. I forgot his first name. But you might find that one interesting too. DVDs, I'm pushing Illustra pretty hard. So there they are again. Here are some 3 websites that you might like. The first one, Answers in Genesis, is Ken Ham's Young Earth View. So if you want to get some information about his view, it's a classy website, a lot of information for you. The second one is Reasons.org. That's Hugh Ross. That's the Old Earth View. If you want to see what the theistic people believe, take a look at BioLogos. I love that name, biology and logos, the Word of God and biology, put them together, right? That's theistic evolution. So that's Francis Collins. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.